Hello again. I'm back with one more video in our market structure series. It actually contains a short discussion of two different kinds of markets, monopolistic competition and oligopoly. To kind of remind you where we're at, let me just put a little smaller version up here of the sort of continuum that we started with a while back, with perfect competition on one extreme, monopoly on the other. We've now had some discussions about each of these two, and the ones that remain to be explored are monopolistic competition and oligopoly. And for different reasons, in the case of monopolistic competition and oligopoly, these are going to be relatively short discussions. First of all, in thinking about monopolistic competition, the reason it's a fairly short discussion is that it is, in fact, and its name would suggest that this is the case, it is a combination in some ways of monopolies and competitive markets. And so we're just going to pull bits and pieces from the monopoly story and the monopoly model, a few other bits and pieces from the perfectly competitive one, and put them together in a new kind of market called monopolistic competition. So let's start there, and then we'll move on and talk about oligopoly. So monopolistic competition, first of all, remember, has all the same characteristics as perfect competition, many buyers and sellers, free entry and exit, perfect or complete information. The one difference is that it contains differentiated products. So there's an opportunity for us to think about more realistic situations where firms may be producing different kinds of goods than the identical goods that we realize under perfect competition. So we're going to talk about the case of differentiated products. Now, in the end, that doesn't have a huge impact on the way the market looks. And the reason is that if I think about a situation where I have a producer of a good that is different from other goods with which it competes, that good really does, for that producer, act very much like a monopoly. Right? So that's the mono part of monopolistic competition. An example might be useful. If you think about the market for fast food hamburgers, you have in places like McDonald's, Wendy's, Burger King, you have local competitors that produce their own kinds of burgers and so on. Each of them is slightly different. If you're a die-hard McDonald's fan, you'd claim a Big Mac is very unique and nothing else like it exists. If you're a Burger King fan, you think the Whopper is all that there is. But they do compete with one another, even if they're not identical in their characteristics and in the way that they taste. So what we're drawing here by drawing a downward sloping demand curve, and this is going to turn out to look very, very much like the monopoly model. In fact, it would be indistinguishable if I weren't telling you the story as we go. Is that if you're going to go buy a Big Mac, you really are going to face a monopoly producer of the Big Mac. That is, the only place you can get it is at McDonald's. Now, there's competition between McDonald's and other places, but if this is the market for Big Macs in particular, then it looks, for all intents and purposes, just like a monopoly market. And it behaves the same way. So we get optimal quantity selected here, where monopolistic competition, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We have the price then is determined off the demand curve. So that's price for the monopolistic competitor. And we have profit calculated the same way that we have in those other circumstances by finding average cost at that quantity, like so. Now, the difference in the case of monopolistic competition compared to normal monopoly is that, well, there is a monopoly for Big Macs, and this is what the world can look like in the short run. In the long run, we do still have, and we'll do that over here, we do still have the possibility for some adjustments. Now, we're going to think about the adjustments in a different way. One of the characteristics of monopolistic competition, just like perfect competition, is free entry and exit. So if there are potential firms making burgers and they look out and they say, look, in my neighborhood, the Big Mac is doing pretty well, McDonald's is doing well, they have this positive economic profit, I want to join the market, when I do, we want to think about what happens to the market for Big Macs and what happens to the market for Whoppers and so on. And what's going to happen is that the demand curve, and therefore the marginal revenue curve, since these two things are sort of acting as a team, as a pair, the amount of demand associated with the Big Mac in particular is going to start to slide to the left. As you have more and more fast food places in your town, you can imagine the demand for fast food burgers being divided up against a larger and larger number of competitors. And so as that demand curve shifts to the left, you're going to see profits start to get squeezed. Now we're going to have the same kind of zero profit condition that we did in perfect competition, but the picture is going to end up looking a little bit different. And so let me draw you a quick sketch. This is one that has to be kind of built in a very specific way, but a quick sketch of what that long run outcome is going to look like. So we're going to get entry, and if there's positive profits, we're going to get entry. It's going to sort of decrease or depress the amount of demand for Big Macs. If McDonald's was losing money on the Big Mac, you would expect there to be some exit that would help shift demand to the right. So we have the same kind of dynamic that we did before. Profits draw in new firms, losses drive out existing firms, and it's only when we get to zero profit that we get a long-run equilibrium. So the way that this one is going to go is that the demand curve, and maybe we'll draw it down here now, has shifted in pretty significantly for the Big Mac. And it's shifted in a very particular way. It's shifted in so that at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, oops, forgot to label that, equals marginal revenue, which is right here. When I project up to get the price, it turns out to be a price that's exactly tangent to the average cost curve. And what's important about that is that means that price in monopolistic competition is equal to average cost, which means profit is equal to zero. So that's the long run kind of picture for monopolistic competition. Now one last thing's worth noting, I guess. In the case of perfect competition, we had the same zero profit outcome, right? But because the demand curve was flat, that zero profit outcome occurred down here at the bottom of the average cost curve. Remember, we had a horizontal or perfectly elastic demand. It was sliding up and down. And so we end up at the bottom of the average cost curve, and we could say, oh, that's sort of an efficient outcome. Not sort of, it is an efficient outcome, right? We're at the bottom of the average cost curve. You'll notice here we're not, right? We're getting a zero profit outcome sort of up and kind of curved around to the left on this side of the average cost curve. Now that kind of inefficiency that results, right, for one thing, we end up at a smaller quantity than we would if the market was competitive and with higher per unit costs, higher average costs. That inefficiency is worse the more different the products are. And the way that you can see that is to realize that the slope of the demand curve is largely what's describing how different the products are, how different the perception of the products are. If they're quite similar, then we would have a very flat, right? If they're exactly similar, we have the perfect competition case. If they're quite similar, we have a relatively flat demand curve. If they're quite different, as it looks like here, or even more different, we have a much steeper demand curve. The steeper the demand curve, the more different the products, the more up and around the corner we've gone to find our zero profit condition. So that's the story from monopolistic competition. I'm going to get a clean screen. We'll talk briefly about oligopoly, and then that will do it. All right, so here we go. Quick discussion of the market structure called oligopoly. And I mentioned at the outset in this video that one of the reasons why it was going to be a bit shorter is that monopolistic competition combined elements of things we already knew quite a bit about, and that allowed us to move fairly quickly through that discussion. When it comes to oligopoly, the discussion is going to be short, not because it's so compact, but because it's so incredibly long that it could go on and on and on and on and on. In fact, there is no single model of oligopoly, and I think that's an important place to start. Unlike the other three market structures that we've looked at, there is no single way that you can describe oligopoly markets. And the reason goes back to what we described as the characteristics of oligopoly, starting with the fact that it's a market that has just a few sellers. And because there's just a few sellers, those sellers in an oligopoly market are engaged in strategic kind of decision making. And it's important to remember that when we say strategic, what we mean is that there's an see if I can spell and talk at the same time, interdependency between the choices that each of the sellers make and the fortunes or the profits that those sellers earn. So because there's this interdependency, because there are strategic markets, there are many, many, many different variations, no single model of oligopoly. So there are a couple, though, that Colander talks about. In particular, he talks about the case of a contestable market, and I'll let you largely read about that on your own. The story is that if you have a market where there's the possibility of entry, that you can get behavior that starts to look very competitive, even without having an actual competitor there. So that's one possibility. He also talks a bit about cartels or about collusion. And the nice thing about the cartel and collusion models is that they really are just monopoly stories recast, right? So a cartel is essentially a group of firms that gets together and tries to act like a single firm. So if you need to solve a cartel problem, treat it as a monopoly problem, and then at the end divide up the answer into different parts for each of the firms. What I mainly want to point out, though, in thinking about oligopoly is a little bit of foreshadowing of where we're going to go next, and that is a discussion that we're going to have where we talk about game theory. And the reason that this is so important is that game theory is the sort of mathematics of strategy, right? It's a way to think about strategic behavior. And since oligopoly markets are strategic, we have a tool here, and game theory is something that didn't come about and really gain much popularity. It was sort of first developed in the 50s and really hasn't made it down to the undergraduate curriculum, I would say, until the last maybe 10 or 15 years, something like that. So it's very new, very recent, and it's the presence or the development of this new tool that has allowed us to much better understand various kinds of oligopoly markets. And so most of our discussion of oligopoly will get sort of rolled into the chapter that comes up in the next module where we talk about game theory. So for now, I'm going to let you read through the bit about contestable markets and cartel behavior and make some comparisons there. And when we get to game theory in another chapter, then we'll be looking at things a little bit more specifically with this nice new tool that we have. So that's all I have for you for today. I will talk with you soon.